articles from a book called Psychotherapy Grounded in the Feminine Principle. And that's been a really, really popular book. It's probably one of the articles that when we finish a therapeutic communications class, that students say, this was it. This catalyzed my thinking. This was right for this program. And I just want to say a couple things about that. That this program is called Integral Counseling Psychology. And we talk a lot about being instead of knowing. And we talk a lot about the whole notion of feeling into one's experience. And I think it's really something about not knowing that is very much a part of our thinking, way of being, doing work in this department. And I think most of you are here really resonate with that. So we're very excited to have Barbara Sullivan here, who also wrote The Mystery of Analytical Work. If you don't know this book, this is her newest book. And it's called Readings from Normal Ambient Healing. So Barbara Sullivan is an analyst at the Jung Institute, and she is in private practice in Berkeley. So we're excited to have her, and this is going to be both lecture and some back and forth and some clinical work. So I think we'll all really like that a lot. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay. My husband has a whole bunch of those new books, and anybody who wants to buy one, I would love to sell you one at the end of the meeting. They're $36 each. So I've been asked to frame my presentation in terms of the divine feminine. And it's really just going to be a framing. But when we think about the feminine principle, what we think about is receiving and holding and being patient and sitting with unknowing and trying to meet the person where they are. And this is all part of the listening process. People think when you talk about archetypes that it's something very grand and an enormous experience. But I tend to think that archetypes are part of everyday life. There's some chairs up here and over here. Don't be shy. But I tend to think that the archetype structure are everyday experiences. And so the feminine principle might sound very exalted and special, but we have to think about how it manifests itself in the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day work in our offices with clients. And so that's what I'm going to try to talk about. But the main thing I'm going to be talking about is listening. Beginning therapists, middle therapists, advanced therapists, everybody always wants to know, what should I say? What should I do? And the real answer is, well, you should listen. And you should learn to listen. And if you can really listen, when you start practicing listening, you start to realize that no matter how hard you listen, there's going to be enormous parts of what the patient is trying to tell us about that we're not going to get. So it's a kind of infinite process of working on your listening for your whole career. And the more you're able to hear, the less concern you need to have about what to say. When you are really involved in trying to listen, you can forget about what to say. And when you can hear something important, you won't have any trouble thinking of something to say. So I'm going to be talking tonight about listening. There's a few chairs up here for a couple, 3 people to come on up to the front. Please come up. So in order to think about how to listen, we want to think about what is going on in a clinical hour. What is happening here? And just the most simple way to frame it is that one person is bringing his or her suffering to another person and asking, can you help me? that's an enormously charged situation. As we're going to talk about, we're having emotions at every moment of our lives. Our psyches are emotion processing machines, as it were. But in the clinical hour, emotions are tremendously highly charged. The person who's bringing in his most vulnerable, deepest, most painful places, obviously, this is a kind of a life or death situation for him. But it taps into the therapist's suffering too, so that the therapist is also being thrown into the ways that we are vulnerable and we are in pain and we haven't solved all the problems of life either, so that both people are right up against their most sensitive emotional places. Those sensitive emotional places are activated. Now, to try to understand what's happening when that goes on, we can just take this current situation as an example. Each of us is sitting here having some kind of emotional experience. It might be kind of obvious that I'm having an emotional experience. I'm the presenter, and so I'm thinking, oh, I want people to like me, and I want people to think well of me, and am I going to be smart, or am I going to stumble over my words? Do I look okay? So that's kind of obvious. But each of you, I think, are having an emotional experience too, which is partly in relation to what you're hearing. But there's going to be a lot of discussion, and so people are going to be having feelings like, oh, I hope I have something smart to say. What will people think of my contribution? Oh, I'm so embarrassed, I never have anything to say. I'm too shy to speak up, and there are those smart people who talk a lot. And besides that, over across the room, I see this girl who I think is really cute, and she's sitting next to this guy, and does that mean that she likes him, and is she ever going to be interested in me? And, you know, there's endless permutations on this. Someone else has a purse that looks so attractive, I'm envious of it. Whatever. There's all these emotions that each of us are trying to process. And just the way our body has evolved to take care of all kinds of physical problems that come up, keeps our heart beating at the right rate. We don't really know anything about that, but our body is taking care of that, cleaning the toxins from our blood and whatnot. In the same way, our psyches have evolved to try to cope with this endless emotional river that we're in. The river might be calm and peaceful at some points, and it's tumultuous and enormous rapids at other points. But whatever the state of the river is, we are in that river, trying to swim, the river of emotions. And our psyches have evolved to help us cope with this. So how does it do this? Well, first of all, at any moment in your life, you're being assaulted with an enormous number of raw sensations. There's visual things coming in, there's sensory, tactile experiences, you're hearing things, you're smelling things, you're feeling sensations from inside your body. There's this enormous sensory onslaught going on, and obviously we can't be conscious of most of it. Most of it is being sorted by our minds, or our brains, or our psyches. At the same time, our emotions start in that same kind of raw state. It's not as though you feel sad. What you feel to start with is a kind of a proto-emotional experience, which is raw. It's not mentalized yet. It's not something in your mind that you can say, this is sadness, or hunger even, or insecurity, whatever, any word you want to put to it. To start with, first you're aware that something isn't right, or is painful, or is uncomfortable, and you don't gradually you're able to put a word to it in your mind. But even before you're aware of it exactly in any way, often there's an emotion going on. Bion called this moment in time a beta element. It's a mixture of the sensory things coming in and the emotional affects coming up. And they're both in this same state of not a mental event yet. It's just what it is. And our psyche is trying to turn it into a mental event. We don't actually have any direct contact with the outer world. And, you know, we feel as though we do. You touch this chair, you think, I'm feeling the chair. But you're not really feeling the chair. What's actually happening is that electrical impulses are being sent up your neurons to your brain from the sensation of your fingers touching the chair. And your brain and your psyche are translating those electrical impulses into a sensation that I would call this surface nubbly, say. And it looks black, but what's actually happening is that wavelengths are coming into my optic nerve, which is carrying that along to my brain, which is translating it into what we call black. There's no blackness in the world. The world is just wavelengths coming at us. And all of the things, all of the senses that we have are like that, and all of our emotions are like that. And so the first task of the psyche is to turn this fact, as it is, into something mental that we can think about. Another way to put this is that the psyche's first task is to symbolize what is going on for us. And especially in terms of our emotions, we have to turn it into a feeling like sadness, or hatred, or love, or lust, or whatever. Until it's been mentalized, we can't do anything with it. If it's not mentalized, if it's not symbolized, we can't think about it, we can't remember it, we can't dream about it, we can't feel about it. It has to be mentalized in order for us to do any of those things, whatever it is. So for example, think about a newborn baby, and he's hit with a hunger pain, and he doesn't know what that is. He's never experienced this before he was born. All he knows is that something bad is happening. He can't differentiate between inside and outside. He has no idea what it means. He has no idea that it's time limited. All he knows is that something very bad is happening, and he makes a noise in response, crying. And if he's in a good enough world, he gets picked up by somebody who puts either a breast or a bottle into his mouth. Now he has a new experience. Now he's feeling a different kind of feeling, and it's good. It feels nice. And he's pleased with this. And it's in his mouth, so it's going on. He doesn't need to think about anything. He doesn't need to mentalize anything in that situation. The breast is in his mouth. He's feeling good. You might say it's a thought of a breast that he's able to have while the breast is in his mouth, but it's not really a useful thought. As soon as the breast is not in his mouth, he's not going to be able to think about a breast, because there was no pressure on him to symbolize what was going on. The pressure comes from the suffering. The fact of a breast in your mouth is not useful for you to grow mentally, because to grow mentally, you need to be able to think about breasts that satisfy and breasts that tantalize or disappoint by their absence. If the client finding is called a good breast and a bad breast. You have to be able to have some kind of image in your mind of the breast in order to start to do any kind of psychological work with what's going on with it. And the pressure for doing that, for translating that experience of the breast in my mouth into a mental image, and for a baby, it's obvious it's going to be an image, it's not going to be a word, into a mental image of a breast. The pressure for that comes from when it's not there, when I'm in pain. That's when I'm trying to do something to figure out what's going on. And so at that point, with enough experience, with the actual physical experience, I begin to be able to have an idea in my mind that there is this thing called the breast, and when I have this kind of physical experience, what helps me feel better is this breast, or it could be a bottle, it's all the same thing. So in order to do that, you need to be able to tolerate suffering. And that's a very important thing that goes through all of life. In order to mentalize, in order to symbolize, you need to have some respect for suffering. You need to start with an attitude that pain is part of life. It's not a symptom of failure. It doesn't mean I'm doing life wrong, that I'm lonely or frightened or isolated or any of the other bad feelings that we all experience. And very often, I mean, our culture pushes us, and many of us have been raised to think, if we just do life right, we won't suffer. People won't break up with us, marriages won't go bad, children won't have problems in school if they're doing things right. And none of that is true, because you can do things absolutely as right as anybody can do them, and there's still going to be lots of pain. So we need to take that in, and to whatever extent we were raised in families that take that attitude, we're very lucky. And to whatever extent we were raised in families that take what seems to me to be a more ordinary attitude of pain as a symptom of failure, that's a barrier to our development. That's a barrier to symbolizing. So how do we symbolize these unsymbolized events? This is an unconscious process that our psyches do. We don't know how it happens any more than we really know exactly how our heart keeps beating at the right pace. It's something the psyche does automatically. Bion called it alpha function, which is a meaningless term, but it's just a way to refer to this process of turning raw experience into symbols. And so we can call that alphabetizing. Okay? Now, we can't symbolize everything that's happening to us. And again, remembering that pain is not a symptom of failure, an inability to symbolize everything is not a symptom of failure. There's no one who can symbolize everything. And I believe that there's no one who can't symbolize anything. So we're all of us someplace on this continuum between total inability and total perfection. Some people can do much more symbolizing than others can. What happens when you can't symbolize something? When you can't symbolize an emotional experience, what happens is that you can't think about it. You can't dream about it. All you can do with an unsymbolized experience is get rid of it. And we get rid of it in a variety of ways. We discharge it. The most hopeful way that we discharge our, what we could call unbearable emotional experiences, unthinkable emotional experiences, what we do with them, the most hopeful thing is what we call projective identification. Does everybody here see clients? Is there anybody here who has not seen any client? Oh. Okay, well, So keep this in mind for when you do this. One of the most common things that happens is projective identification. You're sitting there in the, you may go out to get your patient in the waiting room, and if you've had a few months of work, you might be able to start noticing this. Before you even bring the person into your office, you feel annoyed with him. And you don't know why, but there's just something about the way he is that makes you mad today. And you know, you're thinking, oh, I'm supposed to be a therapist, I'm supposed to be welcoming him and open to him. I just feel so annoyed though. Probably that's a projective identification, which means that he has taken a feeling that he can't experience and given it to you. We don't know how this works, but it does work. This is the basic way that babies and mothers communicate. The baby starts to cry, and the mother feels, anybody who's been around a newborn knows this, the mother feels anxiety. Ah, he's crying. What's wrong? Is he hungry? Is he cold? Is he wet? You know, did he have a bad dream? And it's terribly upsetting to listen to a baby cry. You really want to figure out what's going on. The baby has put his state into you a lot with his crying. And as the mother sits there and holds this state inside, she's thinking, what is the problem? Is it this? Is it that? Is it the other thing? She's holding it inside. She's containing it. She comes up with an idea. Let's say she thinks my baby's hungry. She picks the baby up. In the most optimal situation, she thinks, oh, you poor thing. You think you're dying. But you're not dying, sweetie pie. You're just hungry. And I can feed you. We can fix that. And isn't it wonderful that you want to be alive? That you want to live. So what she's done there, this is like an optimal example. What she's done is that she's taken his terrified state into herself, and she's understood it well enough, and she's detoxified it. She's taken out the terror, and she's saying, oh, don't worry, you're not dying, you just need some food, and here it is. And she's saving the valuable part of his terror, which is his wish to live. And she's giving that back to him too. Now, of course, the baby doesn't understand her words, but he understands the tone of her voice, and he understands the valence of her skin, and he can feel the way her breathing and her heart are up against him. And so he gets this message back. And this is a very fortunate baby because he's getting a really full message back that understands his feelings and saves what's valuable in them and makes them manageable. And the baby begins to develop the capacity by identifying with his mother. He begins to develop the capacity that she has, which is, to start with, to hold a distressing emotion inside and think about it. This is the same thing that happens in therapy. That patient who I'm irritated with before we even get in through the door, we sit down together and hopefully I can sit there thinking, what's going on here? Why am I irritated with this person? I like this person. I looked forward to seeing him. What is going on? And gradually, perhaps, as I listen to what he says and try to think about it symbolically, hopefully I will come up with some kind of idea. Just to be very crude about it, it might be something like, you know, I'm realizing I think I hurt your feelings last time when I said blah, 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 and you're maybe feeling a little mad at me as you come in today. That's a possibility. That'd be kind of a one-to-one sort of projective identification. And you can see it might have the same function that the mother of the baby was having. if he's giving me his feeling that way, we can start with the assumption he doesn't have his feeling. If he had his feeling, he could come in and sit down and say, you know, when you said blah, blah, blah last time, I was really annoyed because it's blah, blah, blah. But he doesn't have that capacity. So he has to kind of project it to me. When that works, that's great. Sometimes, often, the mother, you do this with everybody, with your friends, with your lovers, with your children, with your parents, and with your therapists. Unfortunately, you also do it with your patients, but we can't be perfect. We do this every place we go. Often, what we need, you come to somebody and you are projecting upsetting emotions, they may not be able to take them in and think about it. They may just feel like, what are you doing? You're being, what are you laying on me? Get away from me, in essence. When your unthinkable, unbearable emotions are stuffed back into you, what are you going to do with them then? You still can't think about them. You need somebody to help you in order to think about that. The biggest way that we get rid of these feelings that we can't tolerate is through one kind of discharge or another. The most obvious one is enactments. For example, when the patient's enactments might be things like coming late to hours, forgetting to pay you, forgetting hours altogether, maybe going to see a different therapist because they're mad at you, or, there's sort of an endless number of things that we can do in those ways. Therapists' enactments can look very similar. We can come late to hours. We can even forget hours. That's really bad. It's really good to try not to do that one, but everybody's going to do it at some point. And I shouldn't say bad. It's a message. It's a really intense message, though, that there's something going on here that's very difficult to think about. We can undercharge people or overcharge people, but a lot of enactments are much more subtle. We also get rid of these unbearable, unthinkable emotions by putting them into our body. All these gestures I'm doing with my hands, they're not really adding all that much. They're probably discharging emotions that would be hard for me to just hold on to inside me. You see this a lot, people start swinging their leg. That's a very common thing, or twirling a bit of hair around. People also can discharge emotions through talking. That's one of the ways, that's one of the things therapists do a lot. I'm feeling really anxious. I don't know what's going on here. I have to say something. Well, I think that I think that you have mixed feelings about your mother, and that's why this is happening. Whenever you find yourself tempted to use some really stock interpretation, especially if it's an interpretation that you and the patient have already talked about, hang on to it. Probably it's not going to contribute anything, and probably it's anxiety. There's enormous anxiety being a therapist. You hear stories that are very disturbing and very frightening and very painful, and you are the person who's supposed to help with it. It's quite a shocking thing to realize. There was this time early in my career, I was seeing this new person, and they were telling me, I don't know what the story was, but I know it was really intense. And I thought, ooh, you should see someone. Oh my God, they're seeing someone. So anyway, one of the ways that a therapist can discharge is by making an interpretation, where the point is not really that I am seeing something that is unique to this moment that I could never say to another person, that is very special right here, right now. Then then it might be worthwhile saying. But loads of the things that therapists say aren't like that. And probably you don't need to say them, and it's an anxious response. So this alphabetizing process that I'm talking about, the other place that we can discharge feelings is into our body in the various psychosomatic things that we all know about. You get a headache, you get a stomach ache. Now, I believe myself that we are unified psychosomatic organisms, that our bodies and our psyches are two facets of one thing, two sides of a coin. And I do not believe that it's possible to get a physical illness without a psychological element being involved in it. Just the way I don't believe that you can have a psychological experience without your body having some involvement. And so some of the emotions that are unthinkable and unbearable get discharged depending on the weak spots in your organs and your psyche. So, you discharge over and over some poisons inside you into your liver or into your kidneys or into your heart or into your immune system. And when you're 60 or 70 or 80, the organ that's been the target of this begins to give up. It's been injured so much. So I believe, this is my belief, I can't prove it, but it's what I'm suggesting, that we do discharge these feelings into our bodies, and it impacts us physically as well as emotionally. So as we're alphabetizing, to whatever extent we can alphabetize, we're creating a constant stream at a very deep unconscious level of symbols, pictographs for the most part, but it could be other senses could be involved in this. It could be a bar of music. You might, if you're a musician, you might dream about a piece of music, and it might be very meaningful emotionally what that piece of music was capturing for you. But there's this constant stream of these symbols being created at every moment of our lives in an attempt to symbolize what's going on with us. I believe the stream of pictures is being created all the time, but some of what's going on with us is too much so that we will create some images of what's happening and some of it we can't. Some of it is being discharged or left unthought. There was something else here I wanted to get to. So, when we think about life in this way, we have a different way of thinking about clinical work than was true until the last 10 or 20 years. Historically, at the turn of the 20th century, when psychoanalysis was first being developed, they were having these amazing awarenesses that no one had ever had before. Oh, look at what this dream means. Oh, look, he wants to sleep with his mother and murder his father. And there was this theory, if we tell the patient what's going on with him, it will enable him to take hold of it and to be in charge instead of being driven by these emotions. And to some extent that worked in those days because the new ideas were strange. But they're not strange anymore. Everybody knows that there's an unconscious, and everybody knows that there's an Oedipal complex. And it doesn't mean that much anymore to translate things into interpretations. Occasionally it does, but mostly it doesn't. Mostly the patient comes late, and the therapist says, you're late because you're afraid of experiencing how important I am to you. And the patient says, oh yes, I can see that. And next time he comes late, because nothing has changed. He's got this idea in his head. It might be the right idea, but it hasn't touched him in a deeper place. If we think about this problem with symbolizing, if we stay with the idea that we're all having emotional experiences that are unthinkable and unbearable, the task of therapy, instead of being to understand what's going on with you, the task of therapy becomes to be able to experience what's going on with you. And that's a very different orientation. Of course, you're still going to say things to people. And the topic that you're talking about is still what's going on with the patient's psyche. So what you say might look like an interpretation, but if what your goal is to help the person symbolize the emotional experience that he's having at this moment, that's how we're going to learn to symbolize, right? It's not going to help us to figure out what we might have experienced last night. We're wanting to learn how to symbolize life as it goes on, so we're trying to practice how can we symbolize what's happening right now. And when the patient can't, maybe the therapist can help out with a suggestion. It looks like you're feeling frightened, for example. That might be helpful. But it's a really new task. Instead of the task being to know myself, the task becomes to be myself and to live myself, to live my life. And that's a really important thing to hold on to inside yourself, that what you're trying to do is to help someone experience themselves. When alpha function is working well, the psyche is producing this constant stream of dreaming that's working over the emotional demands of this moment. Let me say another thing about this. When I can't symbolize, remember that breast in the baby's mouth. The breast in the mouth, it is what it is. It is a breast. And it's not my breast, it's just there. I don't have to have any experience of myself. All I'm having is this lovely experience of drinking milk. When the breast is gone, and I'm suffering a little bit, and I'm working to figure out what is going on with me, what is this pain about? Oh, I remember there was that nice, soft, warm thing that made it all feel better. I have a little picture of it maybe in my mind. There's a me involved. That's the beginning of there being a me. It's the breast I get relief from, the breast I love, my breast, my special breast, as opposed to just the breast as it is. And we see this in adults. You can see this, there's the person who comes in and says to you, that David is a really mean person because he did this to me. Or you can have the person who comes in and says, that David really hurt my feelings. It felt so mean to me. There's a me in that now. It's not that David is objectively a mean person, like a fact about him, like he's 6 feet tall. It's an experience I had with David. So when you can symbolize, you begin to build a self. You begin to build a me. So when alpha function is working well, you have this constant stream of images, dreaming, that's working over the moment. And another way to say this is that alpha function is the primary transforming level of the psyche. It's using experiences of life to build a self that is related to that life. And so that's what we're trying to help our patients learn to do now. Now, when you are thinking about your patient and what's going on with them, there's two primary functions that you're needing to employ. One of them is something that Bion called a container and contained relationship, and you can surely hear the feminine in that. You take your patient's words, your patient's projective identifications, you're noticing his body language, his facial expressions, the tone of his voice. All of these things you're letting come into you, and you're holding it inside. To start with, you don't know what it means. The patient comes in, he tells you about an experience he had last night with his wife, and something that his son is having trouble with in school. And then he tells you a dream, and then he tells you a memory from his childhood. And while this is going on, you find that into your mind is very insistently pushing images from a movie you saw last weekend, or maybe from a dream that you had 20 years ago, or maybe from an experience of your own child. And you're thinking, this is irrelevant. I don't want to think about this now. I got to pay attention to whatever. But it's not irrelevant. That's your own alpha function, producing images and memories of your own to help you image the emotional experience you're having in this moment, now, with your patient. It might be an experience you had with somebody 20 years ago. It's not that you're remembering that. It's coming to mind as a symbol of what's happening now. So in this container-contained aspect, first of all, we're hearing all this information from the patient, including our own associations, and we're trying to hold all of this inside of ourselves. And to start with, you might feel a little persecuted, because what you're thinking is, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what he's talking about. What does this story about his little boy have to do with this memory about his mother and this hope for his future at work? And now he's telling me a dream on top of it all, plus I'm having these memories or thoughts of my own. And I call this really the stage of bits and pieces. There's all these bits and pieces, and you're just letting them come in and holding them inside. And then something else happens. Maybe it's a new story from the patient. Maybe it's a new image from your own psyche coming up. Suddenly you have an understanding, and it seems like, oh, I get how it all goes together. All these are images of shame, let's say that. He's trying to tell me about how ashamed he is. Or all these are images of hope, or whatever. That stage, all of a sudden, it's not the stage of bits and pieces anymore. Now it's a stage of wholeness. Bion called the stage of bits and pieces the stage of patience. And that's our hope, that we're going to be able to sit there receiving all these bits patiently. It's like a jigsaw puzzle until you see, oh, this is the picture it's making. As soon as you see the picture it's making, perhaps you will comment on that to your patient and say, oh, it sounds like you're talking about shame here. And maybe the patient will say, oh, that's true, I have so much shame, and then he'll start talking about his shame. Very quickly, that picture is no longer relevant. We've moved on to a new stage, and we've got to try to be letting go of our newfound understanding and letting ourselves go back into this stage of not knowing and being with bits and pieces again. So those are the two important functions that we have, the containing and the going back and forth from bits to wholeness, and trying to do that gracefully and comfortably. So as we listen to an hour, and for the rest of the time, we're going to maybe have a little conversation now, and then I'm going to pass out an hour, a process record of an hour from a patient, and we together as a group are going to try to work with this as a dream that the patient and I together are struggling with. And we'll try to imagine what kinds of emotional realities my patient and I are trying to process, trying to bear. And we'll see some really lovely places where I certainly can't bear what's going on. We'll try to understand what's happening in that way. But before we go into that, does anybody have any questions? Okay, back there?
Yeah, I just wanted a little clarification on some of the language that you were referring to that Dion used. You said there was beta functioning, and you described that as like the state prior to the manifestation of whatever was going on. It was just kind of in a diffused place. Is that?
It's not beta functioning, it's beta elements. So that this moment, for each of us, starts as a beta element. That means an unmentalized experience that we're not yet experiencing.
Okay, and then you called it the alpha.
And
you
then
said
the
alpha functioning.
Alpha function is the psyche's function, the function of the psyche that turns that into a symbol.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Does that work? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah?
This specific way of approaching therapy requires the therapist by doing his or her own work, or going to therapy or seeing animals. Because
Yeah.
in a way, it's a lot of work. Before I go into therapy, I'm carrying a lot of my own baggage.
Yes. Well, that's the kind of basic thing that most therapists do is go to therapy. Yes, you have to work on your own personal stuff so you have more and more familiarity with it. But you have to also be working on your stuff in the hour with your patient. You know, your patient is talking to you and you are having an emotional experience. You've got to be struggling with that. And, you know, sometimes you have very upsetting experiences. The most upsetting for most of us is when the patient is threatening to quit. You know, that typically gets a lot of excitement going on inside the therapist, because we all hate being abandoned. And people tend to imagine this is about their income, but I think it's actually much more primarily about being abandoned. And also just about the attachment you feel. You know, you made an investment in this person.
Can I almost say that it's no way that I would go into therapy and be someone so clean and out.
No.
Like, no way. So in a way, it's also like a practice on also taking a risk that maybe what I say could have been my own.
Exactly. I promise you, you will say some things that are really dopey and off. And there's no way around that. And you have to be accepting of that of yourself.
There were two things that I was wondering about. First of all, when you said that you might say to a patient, the theme I'm hearing is shame, would you not want to say that because you would want them to figure it out on their own?
Well, that's an interesting question, and that's the kind of thing, see, there's no way to have an instruction manual, because it all depends on your intuition. But if you're feeling that it would help them to open up to their shame by your articulating that feeling, you might articulate it. And if you're thinking that the shame is unbearable and unthinkable, maybe this is someone who, because of the way he was raised, starts with a feeling that to feel ashamed is so humiliating you never want to admit it. Shame is the kind of emotion that we all want to hide, actually. You might try to put some words to it to help him alphabetize it. Because, you know, you take a word like shame or sadness or happiness, and, you know, any emotion, it doesn't actually define the experience you're having right now. It sort of tells you the ballpark it's occurring. And if I can say to my patient, it looks to me like you're really struggling with shame, if that is news to him, he might be able to say, oh my God, that's right. And it reminds me of this time in my childhood, or it makes me think of this poem I read, or this movie, and he's starting to define his shame. So you're helping him get into the ballpark, but you can't do the work for him. I mean, he's got to do it. But, so the answer to that is sometimes one way, sometimes the other, and see what you do and how it goes.
That kind of leads me to the second thing I
Okay.
was thinking about. In Gestalt, we're talking about awareness and how, like, the theory behind it is that, like, bringing awareness to something will automatically, like, trigger the healing process or unfold. And I was wondering, because you were talking about awareness with Freud and what that meant in sessions, and I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, that's interesting. In this language, that would be as to say that bringing awareness to something enables the alphabetizing process to get started. And sometimes that's true. But there's nothing that's always true. Anything else?
You mentioned sort of helping the patient come up with like concrete sort of memory examples to link their feelings with like maybe a particular memory. Is that an important part of that experience?
No. I meant that if you say, it looks like you're talking about shame, and then he thinks of something from his childhood. See, that isn't really important as a memory, but it's important as a symbol of what he's feeling now. It's like what he's saying, but he doesn't know this. But it's as though what the psyche is doing is saying, this experience now, at least an aspect of it, is captured in this story. And this story comes to mind because it relates to what I'm feeling now. Everything is about now. And the more you ask your people to free associate, the more direct access you're going to be having to what's going on now. And this is also, it's not that you, the therapist, are the most important person to your patient. You might be or you might not be. But you are the person he's with now. You are the person who his emotions are getting triggered by right this minute. It's in relation to you that he's worrying about whether he's going to look good or look bad or be foolish or be inferior or inadequate. All these feelings are coming up with you, and that's why it's about you. So when you're bringing up shame, he's feeling ashamed with you now. And if he remembers something that happened when he was in junior high, that's an image of an aspect of how he's feeling now.
You mentioned something about dreams.
Yeah.
Dreams being an access into symbolization. I wonder if you had any thoughts about people who don't remember their dreams?
But what I'm trying to say is that we're having a dream right now. Every one of us is having a dream right now. And if you can pay attention to your reverie, you have some access to your current dream. So that, I mean, this is kind of crude if you're thinking, oh, I have to remember to get zucchini tomorrow. That's hard to interpret. But if you're sitting here thinking, might be something about feeling hungry, unsatisfied, I don't know. But if, into your mind comes, say, a fight you had with your daughter last week, that's an image of something that you're experiencing now. There's no reason for that to come in except as an attempt to help you mentalize the emotions that are happening now. And that's a dream. And so when you're listening to your patient, when he tells a dream, that's a particular kind of dream. But when he tells you about what he was reading in the newspaper about Obama's attitude towards Social Security and what he feels about Social Security, you know, people talk about all kinds of things that it's kind of obvious this isn't actually their emotional problem. What they're telling us, though, are images that capture the emotions that are gripping them now. Okay, so this is a dream, and that's how we're going to look at this hour, and we'll pass out in a minute, as a dream that we're having together.
So, do you write this down in your process notes, your thoughts? Do you take notes as they're, you know, so you can track it and keep up with it?
I urge you not to take notes. The hour that I'm going to give us, actually, see, I did cheat. It's a telephone hour, and I took some notes. I don't have the capacity to write down both what I'm hearing and what's coming up in me. And one of the biggest reasons not to take notes is it makes my own reverie less available, much less available. It's really not a good idea to take notes, but you often have to, you know, especially you're learning to be therapists, you have supervisors, it's just a real problem, but you do the best you can. So one more question, if that's okay, from here, and then we'll go into the process.
Yeah, I wonder if you could comment for beginning learning therapists about the tension between being present with what the client is saying in the moment and having awareness and drawing on your own reverie. Just kind of like commenting on that as a practice.
Well, usually beginning therapists are too anxious to pay attention to their own reverie. They're having enough trouble trying to figure out what the patient is saying. Sometimes in some situations where you're feeling just terribly lost, it could be a good idea to just stop listening to the patient at all and tune into yourself. The only way you're going to understand another person is by figuring out what is the shape of the imprint he makes on me. Does that make sense? That's how you can find him. And if what's going on is just completely leaving you lost, sometimes it can help to just tune into yourself, what's going on with me. And, but you know, I think that this is something you work on for your whole career. It's not something you ever learn how to do. You just get better and better at it. And life is like that. Alphabetizing is like that. You'll never be able to do it completely. You get better and better. And you never arrive. You never finish.